Imagine being chosen, plucked from your home to live in a palace of breathtaking beauty, draped in silk and jewels. You are now one of the chosen women of the most powerful man on earth, the Emperor of China. It sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? But for the thousands of women who entered the Forbidden City as concubines, this gilded cage was a prison. It was a world of brutal competition, rigid rules, and silent heartbreaks, where your worth was measured in suns, and a single misstep could mean disgrace or death. This is the story of China's forgotten women, and the system that defined their lives. In pre-modern China, the law was clear. A man could have only one wife. This was a pillar of social order. But for the wealthy, the powerful, and especially for the emperor, this law had a shadow, a parallel institution that allowed them to possess countless other women. These women were the concubines. They were a class apart, not wives, not servants, but something trapped in between. They were often purchased, brought into a household without the ceremonies that marked a true marriage. Their purpose was singular and stark: to serve the master of the house and, above all, to produce heirs. This wasn't some casual arrangement. It was a system woven into the fabric of Chinese law, society, and politics for millennia. It had its own brutal logic, its own complex hierarchy, and a devastating human cost. We tell the history of Imperial China through its emperors and warriors. But behind the grand stories of dynasties rising and falling, there are the silent stories of tens of thousands of women. Their lives were spent within high red walls, their days a blur of opulence and terror, their fates hanging by the whim of a single man. This is their story. The selection. So how did a young girl end up in this world? The journey almost always began with a complete loss of choice. In many eras, like the Ming Dynasty, the selection of concubines was a massive, state-run operation. Edicts were sent across the empire, commanding all unmarried girls of a certain age to present themselves for inspection. According to the statutes, very few families were exempt, unless a daughter was already married or had a certified disability, though powerful families could sometimes pull strings. Imagine thousands of young women, some as young as 13 or 14, herded from their homes, leaving everything they knew behind. Let's imagine one of these girls. We'll call her May. She's 14, from a respectable family of minor officials. For her family, this isn't a tragedy. It's a terrifying honor. Having a daughter chosen for the palace could elevate a family's status, bringing them wealth and influence they could only dream of. Each concubine wasn't just a woman. She was a potential pawn on a vast chessboard of power, a tool for her family's ambition. So, May is dressed in her finest clothes, her face a mask of obedience, as she joins the procession of girls heading toward the imposing gates of the capital. The selection itself was a grueling, dehumanizing process designed to clinically assess human assets. One Ming Dynasty selection reportedly began with 5,000 girls brought to the palace. On the first day alone, 1,000 were sent home for being too tall, too short, too thin, or too stout. May, of average height and build, would have passed this first test, her heart pounding. The second day was an examination of voice and manner. The girls were watched for their grace and temperament. Another 2,000 were dismissed. May, coached by her mother to be demure and soft-spoken, would have survived again. Day 3 was an intense inspection of their hands, feet, and gait. This was the era of foot binding, and tiny, delicate feet were the height of beauty. May's feet had been bound since she was a child, a constant, agonizing pain that she, like millions of other girls, was taught to endure as a requirement for a good marriage. Now, that same pain was her ticket to a life she couldn't imagine. Another 1,000 girls were sent away. The fourth day was the most invasive, a gynecological exam to ensure virginity. Only the pure were worthy of the emperor. 700 more girls failed this test, leaving just 300 to be granted temporary residence inside the palace. But it was far from over. For the next month, these candidates, including our May, were under constant surveillance. They were tested on their intelligence, character, and knowledge of art and literature. They were taught the intricate rituals of the court, how to walk, talk, and gesture with perfect grace. The Empress Dowager, the emperor's mother, would personally inspect them, even watching them sleep to check for habits like snoring or talking in their sleep. It was a process designed to strip them of their individuality and remold them into flawless ornaments. From the initial 5,000, perhaps only 50 would be chosen to stay. May, having passed every test, would be given a new name, her old one erased. She would be assigned a rank in the rigid hierarchy that would now define her entire existence. She has been chosen. The gates of the Forbidden City swing shut behind her. She will probably never see the outside world again. Life inside the gilded cage, hierarchy and daily routine. To step into the inner court was to enter a new reality, a world ruled by a complex and unforgiving hierarchy. All the women lived in the Haogong, the rear palace, forbidden from ever venturing beyond its northern walls. It was a labyrinth of courtyards and halls that housed not just the emperor's consorts, but thousands of maids, servants, and the eunuchs who guarded them. At the very top, there was only one, the Empress. She was the emperor's one true wife, the mother of the nation, her position secured by formal marriage and a powerful family. Below her was a meticulously organized system of consorts and concubines. The ranks varied by dynasty, but they were always elaborate. During the Qing Dynasty, for instance, the hierarchy was crystal clear. Directly under the empress were a handful of high-ranking consorts with specific titles. Then, 6 imperial concubines. Below them were an unlimited number of lower-level concubines, noble ladies, female attendants, and so on. Each rank came with a specific allotment of goods, stipends of silver, bolts of silk, and portions of food. Think about it. An empress might get over 20 pounds of premium meat a day, while a low-ranking attendant would receive less than 5. This was a constant, visible reminder of your place. Our May would likely start at the bottom, perhaps as a female attendant. Her new life would be dictated by a routine that was both monotonous and tense. She would wake early and spend hours on her appearance. Makeup, hair, and clothing were her primary tools. The rest of the day was filled with cultured activities, practicing calligraphy, painting, or playing music. Women played board games to pass the long hours. But even this was filled with peril. Every conversation was a potential trap, every friendship a temporary alliance. They were watched constantly by the palace eunuchs, castrated men who served as guards, spies, and messengers. A concubine couldn't even send a letter to her family. She was utterly alone. The single, all-consuming goal was to attract the emperor's attention. With hundreds, sometimes thousands, of women vying for it, this was a monumental task. Many women spent their entire lives in the palace without ever being summoned. They grew old and died in bitter loneliness. The process of being chosen for the night was a bizarre ritual. Each evening, a eunuch presented the emperor with a tray of name plaques. If the emperor was interested, he would simply flip one over. That simple gesture set off a flurry of activity. The chosen woman, our May, for instance, would be bathed and examined by a doctor. Then, to ensure she couldn't hide a weapon, she would be stripped naked, wrapped in a thick quilt, and carried on a eunuch's back to the emperor's bedchamber. Even this moment wasn't private. A eunuch stood guard outside, calling out the time to ensure the emperor didn't linger too long. Imperial secretaries meticulously recorded the emperor's sex life with brushes dipped in vermilion ink, noting the date and time to predict auspicious moments for conception. It was believed that conception was most likely during the full moon, when the female yin energy was at its peak. For a concubine like May, a night with the emperor was everything. It was her only path to a better life. But the ultimate prize wasn't the emperor's affection, it was bearing him a son. A son could elevate a concubine's status overnight, sometimes even allowing her to challenge the empress herself. Failure to produce an heir meant a life of irrelevance, becoming another nameless ghost, haunting the lonely courtyards of the Forbidden City. Rivalry and power plays. Life in the Haogong was a world of serene beauty and silent, savage warfare. The intense competition for the emperor's favor bred an atmosphere of rampant jealousy and intrigue. Every other woman was a rival, and the inner court was a battlefield where victories were won with whispers, plots, and poison. The hierarchy was the source of it all. A higher rank meant better living conditions, more respect, and more chances to see the emperor. A concubine who caught the emperor's eye could rise quickly, earning promotions and the dangerous envy of everyone else. Trapped in their prison with little else to do, the women dedicated themselves to the art of palace intrigue, known today as gongdou. It's a hugely popular genre in modern Chinese television shows, but the reality was anything but entertaining. The conflict could be subtle. A rival might spread rumors to ruin a competitor's reputation, a stray splash of ink on a perfect silk robe before a ceremony. A favorite musical instrument, suddenly broken. Sabotage was everywhere. Alliances were formed and shattered in a heartbeat. Women would band together to take down a rival, only to turn on each other the moment she was gone. The most powerful enemy was often the empress herself. Feeling her position threatened by a beautiful young concubine, or worse, one who bore the emperor's first son, an empress could be ruthless. But the most potent weapon was a child. The whole point of the harem was to produce heirs. A son was a guarantee of status. A concubine who gave birth to a prince was honored, and her family celebrated. This made pregnancy a flashpoint for conflict. A pregnant concubine was a target. Rivals might try to cause a miscarriage through accidents, or by slipping them traditional medicines. The cruelty could come from the top too. The Jing emperor of the Ming Dynasty was obsessed with finding an elixir for eternal life. He believed the menstrual blood of virgins was a key ingredient and forced hundreds of young girls onto a bizarre diet of only mulberries and dew to ensure their purity, their bodies treated as a disposable resource. Once a son was born, he too became a pawn. A concubine's son was always considered inferior to a son of the empress. He was legally required to treat the empress as his primary mother. In some cases, an empress could even legally adopt the son of a concubine, stealing the very source of her rival's power. Punishments for breaking the rules were severe. A woman could be beaten, confined to her quarters, or sent to the dreaded cold palace, an isolated, crumbling courtyard where, out of favor, consorts were left to die in squalor. The system was designed to be unjust. If a wife caused the death of a concubine, she often faced no punishment. If a concubine harmed a wife, she could be executed. This constant warfare took a devastating psychological toll. For our Mei, it would be a terrifying education. She'd learn to trust no one, to analyze every word for a hidden threat. She would see women rise and fall overnight. One day, a friend is praised by the emperor. The next, she's accused of arrogance and is never seen again. Survival meant being invisible until the right moment, and then seizing it ruthlessly. In some rare cases, the women fought back. In 1542, a group of 16 palace women tried to assassinate the notoriously cruel Jing emperor. They crept into his chambers while he slept and tried to strangle him with a ribbon. The attempt failed. The emperor ordered all 16 women, along with his favorite consort, in whose room the attack happened, who was likely innocent, to be executed by slicing a gruesome death by 1,000 cuts. It's a horrific story that shows just how desperate these women were. The ultimate fate. There was no peaceful retirement for a concubine. Her life was bound to the palace, and her fate could lead to unimaginable power or a lonely, tragic end. The best a concubine could hope for was to outlive the emperor and see her own son take the throne. If that happened, she became the Empress Dowager, the most powerful woman in the empire. She could act as a regent for her young son, effectively ruling from behind the scenes. The most famous example is Cixi, who started as a low-ranking concubine. After giving birth to the emperor's only son, she maneuvered her way to the top and ruled China for nearly 50 years. But her story is the lottery ticket, the one in a million exception. A more common but still lucky outcome was for a concubine with a son to be allowed to leave the Forbidden City after the emperor's death and live with her prince on his own estate. This offered relative freedom. but she was forbidden from ever remarrying. For the countless women who never had children, the future was bleak. Upon the emperor's death, these childless concubines were moved to a separate palace or temple to live out their days in isolation. They became ghosts in their own lives, chanting scriptures and waiting to die. But for many, a far more terrifying fate awaited. In the early dynasties, and brutally reinstituted during the Ming Dynasty, was the practice of accompanying death. The belief was that the emperor needed his servants in the afterlife. So, upon his death, dozens of his favorite concubines were forced to join him. They would be given a square of white silk, a command to hang themselves. Others were forced to drink poison, or, in some horrifying cases, were buried alive in the imperial tomb. This practice of human sacrifice continued until 1464, when the Zhengtong emperor finally abolished it in his will, a rare act of mercy. Even without forced suicide, death was always close. A favored concubine of the Guangxu emperor, Consort Zhen, was known for her independent spirit and interest in the West. This earned her the hatred of the powerful Empress Dowager Cixi. In 1900, as the court fled the Boxer Rebellion, Cixi ordered eunuchs to throw Consort Zhen down a well. A brutal end for a woman whose only crime was winning the emperor's heart and Cixi's jealousy. So what might have happened to our Mei? Maybe, through luck and cunning, she caught the emperor's eye and bore him a son, rising to the rank of consort. She would have lived in luxury, but also in constant fear. Or perhaps, like so many others, she was never noticed. She could have spent decades in obscurity, or made one misstep and been sent to the cold palace. Or maybe she was one of the unlucky ones, chosen to accompany her master into the darkness. Her story, like thousands of others, would have been simply erased. The concubine system persisted for thousands of years. It only officially ended with the collapse of the Qing Dynasty in 1912. When the last emperor abdicated, the system fell apart, leaving thousands of women who knew no other life suddenly abandoned. With no one left to manage the palace, many ended up wandering the streets of Beijing, begging for food. The practice itself died slowly. Hong Kong, for example, only officially outlawed concubinage in 1971. It's tempting to see this world through the lens of a glamorous costume drama, but that ignores the profound human cost. The concubine system was built on the dehumanization of women. They were property, political pawns, and breeding stock. Their names, dreams, and ambitions were stripped away, replaced by a rank in a system that valued them only for their wombs and their faces. The legacy is complicated. The system reinforced the idea that women were subservient to men. And yet, paradoxically, the inner court was one of the only places in Imperial China where a woman could access real political power. Women like Wu Zetian, who rose from concubine to become China's only female emperor, or the cunning Cixi, proved that even in an oppressive system, some women could seize incredible power, but for every one of them, there were thousands who were silenced and forgotten. Official histories, written by men, often used these women as scapegoats. When a dynasty crumbled, who was to blame? Not the emperor's failings, of course. It was always the seductive concubine who led him astray. This narrative has erased the suffering of these women, turning them into villains or tragic props. The story of China's forgotten women is not a fairy tale. It's a sobering reminder of the dark side of power and a testament to the resilience of women who navigated a brutal world. Their voices were silenced for centuries, but if you listen closely to the echoes in the empty halls of the Forbidden City, you can still hear their stories. Honestly, digging into this story really makes you see history in a different light. Behind all the palaces and power, these were real women just trying to survive. If you enjoyed uncovering this side of history with me, hit that like button and subscribe. It not only supports the channel, but also helps more people discover these hidden stories. And tell me in the comments, what part of the concubines' lives surprised or shocked you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I read every comment. See you in the next video.